Dark Cosmos presents We Brought Back an Unknown Plant Species from 1 million years ago. Hey Creepypasta fans, it's Joseph, and I'll be your narrator for tonight. Enjoy tonight's sci-fi horror story. Also, if you want to connect and support us, make sure to check out our Discord and Patreon links in the description. And remember, stay cosmic. The tension in the air was so thick, it was hard to breathe. I stood in front of the wormhole with the rest of my team. Jacob, Susan, and Isaac. My skin prickled with every passing second. Historical shadows loomed beyond the rings of light, and we were about to chase after them. We were traveling 1 million years back in time. That was the cause of the tension, or part of it. There's nothing more exhilarating than time travel, and it's nothing like what those ancient movies and novels narrate. It is more complicated, less fancy, and an incredible risk. "Any time now," Susan whispered. I glanced at her and she winked. I smiled wryly. I knew she was trying to ease my tension, but it didn't work. "I wish we had lighter suits," Jacob protested like he always did before the run. The gray suits were thick and heavy. They were made with materials to protect our bodies from the thousands of dangerous rays encountered through the tube. I shivered, but sweat trickled down my temple. My breathing grew heavy, and it echoed in my helmet. My mind replayed the conversation I had with Professor Lar. He warned us against what we were about to do. "Taking things from the past is the same as stealing," he claimed. He didn't understand. He was too conventional and too uptight. Professor Lar was my mentor and I looked up to him. But what we were about to do could change our lives and the world for the better. We could stop world poverty right now, or we could even cure cancer. We were doing the right thing here. I knew it. But why was my heart pounding like a hammer in my chest? I knew the answer. I just chose to ignore it. It was because of the ulterior motive we were all sent here for. The rings of light grew brighter, and we braced ourselves. We could only run into the tube at a precise moment. Too soon, and a force will tear us apart. Too late, and we'll be stuck in a painful time loop. The light turned blue, and we all ran in at the same time. After a few tingles and heat waves, we landed on a desert. The cause of all my worries sat tall in the sands, glowing and basking under the sun. Wardat Dakina. The dark rose. The single flower was mesmerizing, and it called unto me, beckoning me to go closer. "Wow," Isaac whispered. He was a man of little words, and I shared his current sentiment. We plowed our way through the sand to the rose. Jacob brought out a small digger and dug around the sand carefully, not to harm the flower. After his small labor, I gently pulled out the rose with its root and placed it in a glass box. As I closed the box, my stomach dropped. I'd finally done it. I'd become a thief of time. A time thief. But that would not be my only crime. I worked for FIOBS, Federal Investigations of Biological Species, as a plant biologist. We were a secret organization created by the government to research and experiment all sorts of biological threats, nuclear weapons, and even alien species. Cool air greeted me as I opened the fridge. I picked up a bottle of water and closed it. I jumped as I saw my mentor staring at me. "You've done a fine job hiding from me, Gabriel," Professor Lar said dryly. I swung the bottle to my dry lips and forced down the water. "You have to take the rose back," he said. I ground my teeth. "What is so wrong with wanting a little bit of money?" I spat out. "I certainly deserve it. The Wardat Dakina will not give you what you want. The ancient texts clearly say that when its petals fall, they turn to gold," I replied. Professor Lar stepped closer to me, and I took a step backward. "Those texts also say that when the rose is moved, it turns into something different, something dangerous." My breathing grew uneven, and I opened my mouth to speak, but a painful cry echoed through the building. Professor Lar and I glanced at each other before running to the lab. I grimaced as the screams persisted. My heart pounded with every step I took toward the lab. I stumbled to a stop once I entered the laboratory. Dim lights flickered above me. My skin crawled. Something was waiting for me. I forced my feet to move forward, and then I froze. "No," I whispered. "No! No! No! No!" Tears clouded my vision as I saw the lifeless body of my friend on the cold floor. Oh my God! His limbs were torn from his body and scattered across the floor. Vines of thorns hung on each part. His severed head revealed his face. It was contorted in pain. His wide eyes and slack jaw narrated the horrific pain he'd passed through before he died. Professor Lars' terrified whisper sounded behind me. "What happened here?" I turned to see two of the security men. They looked around the lab in confusion. It was at that time that I realized the lab had been torn apart. Papers were strewn all over the floor. Expensive equipment had been torn into pieces. And the rose, Professor Lars said, and my breath quickened. I strode to where I kept it, careful not to touch anything. I gasped and ran my shaky fingers through my hair. The rose no longer lay in the box. It had bored a hole through the box, the table, and into the floor. "Don't touch anything," I heard Professor Lars say. My temples ached, and I rubbed them. "What have I done?" I whispered to myself. "You have to fix this, Gabriel," Michael Fox said. His jerky movements showed his tension, but I was tense too. He'd authorized the time travel to bring the rose back. He'd also been eager to see the gold that the rose would bring. 6 of us stood in his office. Professor Lars stood watching the drama unfold. I should have listened to him. Susan and Isaac remained quiet. They were probably mourning the loss of our dear friends. He had a wife and a daughter, Lisa. I shook my head. "We have to find the rose and take it back to the desert," I said. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Pete asked. He was tall and buff. He must have been one of the government's secret agents. "You freaks create the havoc, and we have to pick up the pieces." I ground my teeth. "I'm not sure yet," I replied, swallowing the words I'd planned to say. Suddenly, the building shook and I swayed. "What?" The building shook again, more violently this time. I fell to the ground and clutched the leg of the table. My body vibrated along with the floor. The quaking stopped after a few minutes, and I drew to my feet. "What the hell?" Pete said, and I followed his gaze. Thin vines with thorns on them lined the walls. I gulped. The dark rose. Pete raised his hand to touch. "Stop!" I yelled at him, but he ignored me. The moment his finger touched the wall, the vine sprung out of the wall and held him hostage. He screamed as the thorns attacked him, piercing through his skin and slicing off his hands. "Help him!" Michael screamed. Professor Lahr went to him and touched him. The vines climbed to his hand. "No!" I scanned the room and spotted a sword. For the first time, I was grateful that Michael designed his office with strange weapons. I grabbed it, raised it, and cut off the professor's right hand. Blood gushed and sprayed from the wound, and the vines devoured the fallen hand. The sword clattered to the ground and my hands shook. Susan quickly wrapped a cloth around his bloody arm. He was panting, but he didn't scream. He had a strange look on his face, like he was in awe. Perhaps it was shock. He must be in so much pain. Pete's severed body fell to the floor, and there was a unanimous gasp. "We'll have to tell the public not to touch the vines," Susan said to Michael. He nodded. Beads of sweat rolled down his face. "I'll hold a press conference," he said. "Just figure out a way to get this thing back to where it came from." "Yes, sir," I said. If only it were that easy. The city was in an uproar. It was as though we were no longer in an apocalyptic era. Michael Fox held a press conference telling the people to stay away from the vines. All the street lights in the city were on since it was night, but the vines were spreading from the walls to the grounds. We would have nowhere to run if this continued. "How did we miss the warnings, Gabe?" Susan whispered. I sighed. It's all my fault. I said. It's all our fault. Isaac said. We were blinded by our greed. The text said it will continue to spread, Susan said. We have to go back to the desert. Without the rose? I asked. We need to know more about this thing, she continued. Perhaps we could find a way to destroy it if we go back in time. We all agreed with Susan, and a few minutes later we were driving to the time machine. When we arrived, we changed into our suits into the van. If Jacob were here, he would have complained about the suit, Isaac said quietly. There was a painful silence and all the hair on my neck rose. Something lurked in the shadows, and we all felt it. Gabriel? Susan whispered. Did she feel it too? The sense of impending doom? My heart beat a tattoo in my chest, and I struggled to breathe. The ground began to shake, just like it had done at FIOBS. Let's hurry to the tube! Susan yelled and we started for the tube. The ground tore open before us, and the vines shot out like claws from the earth. The vines reached for the tube, wrapping it and crushing it. 20 years of hard labor creating the time machine was destroyed in seconds. No! Susan yelled. The vines curled and formed a web of leaves and thorns before us. It was as though it was creating its home. Thin vines formed on the ground, taunting us. Run! I yelled and we headed for our van. The vines wrapped around our van, devouring it as well. We ran in opposite directions. My heart thundered. We were doomed. After what felt like an eternity, we found shelter in a cave away from the time machine. We didn't have our phones, food, or water. What are we going to do now? Susan asked. I rubbed my hand down my face. I have no clue. Isaac sighed. I studied radiology in school, he said. Roses can be killed with vinegar. Susan scoffed. This is no flower, Isaac, she said. If only we could test it at the lab. We've seen what happens when it's touched, I said. So we just sit around and wait to die? She shouted and threw her hands in the air. Susan. I held her arms. Her eyes pooled with tears, and I hugged her. It was a dark night, but the moon shined brighter than any other night. None of this would have happened if I'd listened to Professor Lar. I had to fix this, but I just didn't know how. A migraine started in my head and I leaned against the wall. I was weary of everything that had happened. The vibration started and tears escaped to my eyes. Not again. We have to move, Isaac said. A sob escaped Susan as we began to run again. I turned to see the vines rushing after us through the sand and I increased my pace. I cried out when I saw a body of water. We were caught between the wide ocean and a carnivorous flower. I heard Isaac scream and I turned to look at my friends. Terror filled his eyes. The veins had captured him. Isaac! Susan cried out. Isaac yelled as the vines sucked the life out of him. His eyes bulged out and his jaw went slack. The thorn sliced his body, leaving him in pieces. I drew Susan to me and we ran into the water. Our suits grew heavier as the water soaked us. I waited to follow along with my friend, but the vines didn't follow us into the water. Rather, it retracted. Susan sobbed against my chest and tears rolled down my cheeks. Isaac was gone. Who was next? The FIOBS sent a helicopter to find us and take us to another lab. The city was eerily quiet. It felt like this was the calm before the storm. When we arrived at the lab, we changed into dry, warm clothes. Michael Fox approached us. He no longer looked put together, but disheveled and afraid. We have over 100 dead. His voice cracked. The borders of this city have been barricaded by the vines. Why? I whispered. It's taking over the city, Susan said. I think I know how to stop it. How? Michael rushed to her. I think it's affected by water, she said. When we ran into the water, it stopped pursuing us. We can't be sure that's the reason, I said. I swallowed my frustration. We were scientists. We worked with facts and experiments, not by speculation alone. Well, then what else could have stopped it? Susan asked. My eyes swung from her to the bottle of water on the table. There were vines on the wall. I removed the cap and splashed the water on the wall. A hiss sounded from the wall and something outstanding happened. Susan was right. The thorn slowly disappeared from the spot I had poured it on. It worked, Michael whispered. I started to laugh, but then the thorns appeared on the wall again. Instantly, my shoulders slumped. Maybe if we tried pouring the water at the source, Susan said. I could see her wheels turning. But we don't know where the source is, I said. Then we better start looking, Michael said. It'd been 2 hours since we started looking for the source. We weren't even sure what we were looking for. What if we're looking at this thing all wrong? I asked. Susan looked at me. Her eyes were dull. She was tired. I was too, but we couldn't stop. Susan started, but her eyes widened and she pointed a shaky finger behind me. My throat bobbed as I turned. I stumbled backwards. The vines on the walls and the ground came alive. They bubbled, then burst open, and a swarm of alien creatures emerged. Run! I yelled at the search team. Screams of the search team reached my ears and my insides quaked. The creatures looked like giant mosquitoes, and swarms of them started devouring everything in their path. Susan screamed and I turned to look at her. She hung mid-air as one of the slimy creatures clung to her shoulders. I held her legs and pulled her down. She swung her arms wildly and it let go. We both fell to the ground and my head hit against a hard surface. I heard Susan scream before I slipped into oblivion. My heart pounded and I groaned. I forced my eyes open and I scrambled to my feet. I immediately regretted the movement because my head protested. I forced vomit down my throat. I trembled at the gore before my eyes. Severed heads and limbs lay scattered on the street. It was a bloody mess. Susan! I yelled her name as tears streamed down my face. I yelled again, Susan! And then I fell to my knees, sobbing. I couldn't lose her too. I just couldn't. The streetlights flickered and I looked up. Something blue glowed at a distance, and I squinted. I stood up and went to the light. It crossed to the corner of the street. The glow was coming from the opposite building. It was a pharmacy, or it used to be. Glass shards of the windows were on the floor and the door hung open, broken to the side. I stepped into the building. The blue glow came from the large hole in the middle of the pharmacy. I gasped as I looked inside. I'd just found the source. The aliens swarmed around a beating heart. It looked like they were worshipping it. I felt something move behind me and I jumped. I turned and the lights in the building went off. I saw a shadow move past me and I stumbled backward. I lost my footing and fell into the hole. I yelled till my body smacked against the floor. I curled into a ball. My head and body hurt like fire. If I was going to die, I just prayed it would be quick. I waited for the aliens to devour my flesh, but they just ignored me, bowing before the heart. A throaty laugh echoed throughout the building. A throaty laugh echoed through the building. It almost sounded human. From the blue glow, I saw the shadow of something, a beast or a man. I couldn't tell. The shadow rushed towards me and I scrambled backward. My jaw slackened as my vision cleared. It had slimy skin and wings like the aliens. Its teeth were like fangs and its eyes were deep red. But I knew this creature. I knew this man. Professor Lar? I whispered. Surprise, surprise, he said with a devilish grin. Had the stress of the day finally rid me of my senses? I stared at the terrifying alien before me. He looked like my mentor. Not everyone who walks this earth is human, Gabriel, he said. How is this possible? I asked. He rose up and moved backward. I came from the planet of Dom. It's been so tiring playing human, he said. I thought I was the last of my species until I found out about Wadat Dakina. But you told me not to go. It was all part of the fun, he said. I planted the seed of the rose in Michael's head and produced the ancient text about them. So you did all this for fun? I asked.
I've always loved a good game.
He waved his hands.
It worked, didn't it?
Oh, God. Oh, my God. So many people have died, I whispered. He scoffed.
Humans are the proudest creatures to walk this earth. A little lesson won't hurt.
I rubbed my temples. He spoke as though humans were nothing but animals. I looked at the man I thought I'd known. I'd shared my fears and my dreams with him. I shuddered. Who else in my life was an alien? What's that behind you? I asked. Maybe I could still stop this. He glanced at the heart and grins.
We are waiting.
My breath caught. Waiting for what?
The Queen of Dawn. After the clock strikes 12, she will come to life.
Why can't you go back to your planet? I suggested. He shook his head.
It was destroyed years ago. Earth will be our new home.
My eyes scanned my surroundings, searching for something, anything to stop this madness. I spotted a glass shard at my left and grabbed it. I released a long breath and counted. 1, 2, 3. I rushed to my feet and stabbed his leg with the broken glass. I drew the glass out and ran. He yelled in an unrecognizable language, and the aliens turned their attention from the beating heart to me. I ran for cover, but they were right at my back. Sharp claws dug into my arms, and I screamed. Pain, like a prickling of 1,000 needles, coursed through my skin. I flung the glass shard wildly at them, slicing through anything I could. Suddenly, they stopped attacking me. The city clock chimed as a terror charged through me. It was midnight. The aliens hummed a strange melody. I turned to the source. It glowed brighter. I tried to stand, but my body was on fire. I'd never felt so helpless in my life. Was this it? Was this the end? I'd worked so hard most of my life, and when that wasn't enough, I tried to make a quick buck. My life had been so worthless. I could see the stars in the dark sky. I didn't believe in anything other than science and facts, but I was at my wit's end. So I closed my eyes and prayed. To anything, to everything, to anyone who was listening. My heavy breathing echoed in my ears, and I waited for disaster to strike. A drop of water fell onto my forehead, and I blinked.
Ow!
I heard Professor Lars scream as a heavy patter of rain began to fall. Rain? In summer? The aliens screeched as the water touched them. They ran for cover, but the slime on their body began to droop, and they melted to the ground. Water! I whispered. They were affected by water. Professor Lar always called in sick whenever it rained. I'd never seen him eat or drink. I'd never thought of it much until now. A surge of energy went through me, and I stood to my feet. Professor Lar squirmed as the droplets of water fell onto his skin. They were dangerous beings, and yet their weakness was so very simple. He screamed as he turned into a puddle of slime. My prayer might have worked. I licked my wet lips and walked to the heart. It was still beating. I rose my glass shard to pierce through it. Watch out! I heard Susan scream and I ducked. One of the aliens was drooping slime, but it flew over my head and finally fell to the ground. You're alive! I turned to Susan. We ran to each other and I kissed her. She was shocked, but she shoved her fingers through my hair and kissed me back. I drew back and smiled at her. In that moment, right then and there, staring into her eyes, I made a silent promise to lead a better life. The source, she said, breaking eye contact and looking behind me. She handed me a knife and I dropped the broken glass. I walked to the heart. It beat in a fashioned rhythm, and I stared at it. I hesitated in stabbing it. The beating heart was almost as mesmerizing as the rose was in the desert. Gabriel! Susan's voice jerked me back to the present. I glanced back at the heart. You've got to go, I said before piercing the knife through it. Slime burst out of it and an odor filled the air. Susan took my hand and I sighed. It will take a long time to rebuild this city, but I will do everything I can to help.